welcome to the Mathematicians Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we are demonstrating the life and works of the ultimate polymath, a philosopher, scientist, and mathematician, the one, the only, Aristotle. And from a personal note, this episode is the one I've been the most excited to get down and write so far. Now, given that I have 2 maths A-levels, a master's degree in maths and a PGCE in maths teaching, a sum of 7 years of post-16 education, it is perhaps a little surprising that the most influential teacher in my maths education was Mr. Powell. Or at least surprising if you knew him, given that he taught me history. And even then, not particularly well. As I'm sure you've discovered by now, history does not come naturally to me. Not that I could necessarily blame this on Mr. Powell. But he taught me to analyse sentence structure. Consider, for instance, my last paragraph. Not that I could necessarily blame this on Mr. Powell. Can we determine which words in the sentence are doing the heavy lifting? This and I are the object and subject of the sentence. These could be replaced by any other object and subject, and the meaning would hardly change. Not that my pirate friend could necessarily blame rampant consumerism on Mr. Powell. Here, on Mr. Powell is the prepositional phrase determining where or how the verb of blame will take place. Blame, of course, being the action of the sentence. Again, we could swap these for alternatives, and the structure of the sentence would have the same logic. Not that my pirate friend could necessarily enforce rampant consumerism on the port city of Kingston. Although, on a quick aside, he definitely did. But then, to break it down further, let's use letters to signify any particular term of a sentence. Not true such that A necessarily actions B with effect on C. Now we start to be able to determine the nature of the sentence. What effect does the word necessarily have here? How will the statement be affected if it is removed? Consider the phrases, not that I can necessarily blame this on Mr. Powell, and not that I can blame this on Mr. Powell. In the second phrase, it is impossible for me to blame my poor history skills on my history teacher. In the former, it is only not necessary, and thus I can still blame him if I so choose. What about if I said, not that I can sufficiently blame this on Mr. Powell? Here, Mr. Powell's teaching was not sufficient to cause my poor grasp of history. The implication being that, given my poor grasp of history, there exists a secondary cause, although his efforts in teaching me may or may not have contributed. Isn't language fun? To relate one of his more memorable lessons to me, back to Aristotle. All elephants are grey. His suit is grey, therefore all elephants are inside his suit. What I can tell you is that all history teachers leave a lasting legacy with their students. Mr. Powell was my history teacher, therefore Mr. Powell left a lasting legacy on me. On the topic of legacy, let's turn to a man who arguably was more influential on the last 2,000 years than Mr. Powell. That's right, we're talking Aristotle. Now, if you've been following the episode so far, you will know we've traced the mathematical tapestry woven by the Milesians and geometry, the Pythagoreans and number theory, and the Academy with the myriad players and performers. Today's episode is a little different. Although, arguably, Aristotle could be counted among the ranks of the Academy, he splintered into his own field. Aristotle is usually remembered as a philosopher, and rightly so. But his contributions to mathematics are just as fascinating when viewed in the broader context of his work. Strap in as we explore Aristotle's life, his documentation of ideas, and why his influence is still near universal today. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in Stagirria, a small town in northern Greece. His father, Nicomachus, was a physician to the royal court of Macedon, which might explain Aristotle's early interest in the natural world. At 17, he travelled to Athens to study at Plato's Academy, where he spent the next 20 years, yes, 20 years, That's the same length as me enrolling in primary school aged 4 and receiving my post-grad certificate in education aged 24. Aristotle eventually left the academy when Plato died, likely because of philosophical differences. Plato was big on abstract ideals. Aristotle preferred a more grounded empirical approach. Plato liked to search for broad truths. Aristotle actually cared whether or not he had found them. After some years of travelling and teaching, including tutoring a young Alexander the Great, Aristotle returned to Athens to establish his own school, the Lyceum. Apparently, in ancient Greece, you could only found a school of learning in a common park or exercise area outside the city walls. Also, it would seem. His teaching method, known as peripatetic, involved walking around in circles while discussing ideas. I'm sure that this was not simply a metaphor. In my imagination, this is because the other people working out at the gym didn't appreciate all the nerds talking about featherless bipeds, and so they grouped on the ancient equivalent of a treadmill to pretend to exercise. Originally, the Lyceum was a place of worship for the god Apollo Lyceus. Apollo had been recognised as a god of archery, music and dance and truth and prophecy, healing and disease, the sun, light, poetry, and the list goes on and on and on. A pretty important god. Wouldn't it be a shame if his temple was turned into a gym and then a university? Hey, I'm a big fan of multi-use municipal buildings. I should note that Aristotle was not the only student to break from the academy when Plato died. In episode 15 we met Xenocrates of Chalcedon, and he left with him, and they visited Assos together. It was on Assos that he started his first school of philosophy, where he began documenting all of the different animals he could, and cutting up all the ones he could find. It's interesting to note here that while he did some amazing works on the anatomy of animals, much of which was not improved for the next 2,000 years, he did not discover enough to write down the anatomy of humans. It was considered a major taboo to dismember a human's remains, so the only philosophers in the group that could describe the insides of a human were the ones who had also been soldiers. Aristotle's intellectual reach was as broad as it was deep. He wrote on biology, ethics, politics, physics, and metaphysics, essentially building a proto-encyclopedia of human knowledge. He also developed theories on ethics, advocating for a golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between extremes. Moderation, after all, is the key to not going off the rails. To give some examples, in battle, is it better to be cowardly or brave? Well, neither. The coward will not win and the brave man will make mistakes. In love, is it better to be fawning or cold? Neither. Just try being decent. Also, don't get dating advice from the same bloke who's giving you military advice. In physics, Aristotle proposed a geocentric model of the universe, which placed the Earth at its centre. Though this idea was not new or particularly interesting, it dominated scientific thought for nearly 2 millennia, and it is crucial for later debate that Aristotle himself believed it. He is, after all, the crucial authority to defer to. Perhaps I could take a moment to discuss his authority. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Aristotle was a know-it-all. Although, to be fair to the man, he probably did really know it all, and that's just based on the books that we still have. He very literally defined the field of study for the European tradition, mainly following threads in the Islamic tradition, but as it filtered through into Europe in the Middle Ages, he stole centre stage there too. With your permission, or without, because this is my podcast, I'm going to take a few minutes to read out all of his published titles. And I know you probably listened to this to help you fall asleep, but I want you to really pay attention to this part so that you don't miss out on how significant and prolific he was. Categories discusses different ways things can be classified, forming the basis of Aristotelian logic. On interpretation explores language, meaning, and the relationship between logic and reality. Prior analytics develops the theory of syllogistic logic, forming the foundation of deductive reasoning. Posterior analytics examines the nature of scientific knowledge and how it is derived through demonstration. Topics analyzes methods of argumentation and dialectics used in philosophical debates. Sophistical refutations discusses logical fallacies and how to identify and counter them. Physics explores the nature of the physical world, motion, time, and change. On the Heavens examines the structure of the cosmos, including Aristotle's geocentric model of the universe. On Generation and Corruption studies how substances change and the nature of elemental transformation. Meteorology covers natural phenomena such as weather, earthquakes, and celestial events. Metaphysics investigates the fundamental nature of reality, being, and existence. Nicomachean ethics discusses virtue, ethics, and the pursuit of eudaimonia, which is human flourishing. Eudaimean ethics, another ethical work similar to the Nicomachean ethics, but with some differences in emphasis. Magna Moralia, a more introductory ethical work. Politics examines different form of government and the ideal political system for human flourishing. Rhetoric analyzes persuasive speech and argumentation techniques. Poetics discusses literary theory, especially tragedy and epic poetry. De Anima, or On the Soul, explores the nature of the soul and its relation to the body. Parva Naturalia, a collection of short treatises on the senses, memory, sleep, and dreams. A History of Animals describes various animals and their characteristics based on observations. Parts of Animals explores animal autonomy and Aristotle's theory of biological teleology. Movement of Animals discusses the principles behind animal movements. Progression of Animals examines how and why different animals move in different ways. Generation of Animals investigates the reproduction and hereditary of living beings. Problems, a collection of questions and answers on various scientific and philosophical topics. On Colours, a short work on the nature of colours and possibly spurious. On Things Heard discusses the nature of sound and hearing. On Breath examines theories about respiration, although again its authenticity is debated. And that is just the 28 works that survived. We also have fragmentary evidence of the following. Protreptricus, a philosophical exhortation encouraging people to pursue philosophy. On Philosophy, a general discussion on philosophical subjects, possibly engaging with Plato's ideas. On the Ideas, a critique of Plato's theory of the forms. On the Good, a discussion of ethical and metaphysical notions of the good. On Justice, explored different conceptions of justice. On Pleasure, likely examined different philosophical views on pleasure. On Wealth, discussed the nature and role of wealth in a human life. On Prayer, likely addressed religious or metaphysical aspects of prayer. On Education, a work on the best methods of educating citizens. On Poets, a discussion of poetry, possibly extending Aristotle's ideas of the poetics. On the Pythagoreans, a study of the Pythagoreans' philosophy and mathematics. On the Elements, likely a work on the fundamental constituents of matter. The State of the Laws, possibly comparing different legal systems. The Constitutions, a series of work describing difficult political constitutions, of which the constitutions of the Athenians partially survives. Whew. Now you might recognise from this list that there are many subjects you might study at school with names from his work. He literally invented the study of metaphysics, physics, ethics, politics, poetics, rhetoric, the analysis of logic, biology, zoology, meteorology, psychology. I could go on and on. But this is a mathematicians podcast, not the I read out a long list podcast. Perhaps I could summarise my point then by saying that for the most of history, he wasn't referred to as Aristotle, but simply the philosopher. Let's turn our focus to Aristotle's contributions to mathematics. Some might argue that he was not a mathematician. He didn't write a book on numbers or shapes, and at this stage of history, I'm still not interested in astronomy. But my argument is that he introduced a new branch of mathematics, logic. And I will preface this a little as well, as many people contributed to logic. Aristotle didn't invent what we think of logic today, not in the same way that the Pythagoreans developed the number theory that we still use, but Aristotle invented set theory. Now, a quick read of the Wikipedia page on set theory does not contain a reference to Aristotle, so I appreciate it is an unconventional take on the authorship. but hopefully I will be able to convince you why I think Aristotle should be in the set of inventors. My first argument is his approach to language. He distinguished between a thing that is of a thing and a thing that is in a thing. Consider a man. I'm a man and Mr. Powell is a man. Man is predicated on a subject, in that it is said of us. But the knowledge of Mr. Powell's birthday is a thing that exists inside of me. When I die, the knowledge I had will have left me. Also, that knowledge cannot be ascribed to Mr. Powell, it only exists in me. But when I think of Mr. Powell's birthday, it reminds me of celebrations, and this too exists inside of me, but also it can be assigned to a different subject or predicate, in that Mr. Powell's birthday is a national celebration. Now, consider the grey suit. It does not describe Mr. Powell or anything, nor is it a constituent part of anything, it just is. Concepts can be a part of something, a description of something, or both, or neither. Then he took the unifying concept of a thing and determined that there must be a spanning partition in the way that we can describe the thing. In other words, all descriptions fall into a category of 10 circles in a Venn diagram with no overlaps. Consider the phrase, the tall, quantity, history teacher, substance, with grey, quality, hair, who is twice, relation, the age of his colleagues, sat, position, in the staff room, place, yesterday, time, ears burning, state, writing his resignation letter, action, while being referenced by his former student, affection. We have substance, what something is, like a person or a tree. Quantity, how much of something, like length or number. Quality, what kind of thing it is, like colour or shape. Relation, how it compares to something else, like being double or half. Place, where it is, in the marketplace. Time, when it is, like yesterday or last year. Position, the way it's arranged, like sitting or lying down. State, a condition resulting from an external factor, like wearing shoes or armour. Action, what it's doing, like cutting or burning. And affection, what's being done to it, like being cut or burnt. This takes us to another work of Aristotle, the Posterior Analytics, where he ignites a fire that is still burning, on universals and particulars. Is there such a thing as a history teacher? Well, yes, because Mr. Powell is a history teacher. What happened if all the history teachers disappeared? Would the universal of a history teacher also disappear? Okay, then no, there is no universal, only this particular history teacher. Alright, now how can you say he is a history teacher if there is no universal definition to compare him to? But this idea leads naturally into some critical terminology for logicians. For all and there exists. I would very happily map what Aristotle talks about into set theory, in that we can say, for all A, B. All history teachers are impactful on their students, but this is another way of saying that the set of all history teachers is a subset of the set of people that are impactful on their students. A quick shout out to Dr. Noble, my maths teacher, also impactful, but not in the set of history teachers. We can also say that there exists an A such that B. There exists a history teacher with a grey suit. But that's just another way of saying that the intersection of the set of history teachers and the set of people with grey suits is not empty. We see this kind of logic being developed in his work on genus and species. All humans are mammals, all dogs are mammals, there exists a mammal that is Socrates, etc., etc. If you want the fun words for this, we can call them universal quantification and existential quantification. But this leads beautifully into Aristotle's most important contribution to mathematics, analytical logic. Aristotle's development of formal logic was instrumental for mathematicians. His syllogistic reasoning provided a systematic way to derive conclusions from premises. While modern mathematicians use symbolic logic, the principles can trace their lineage back to Aristotle. You might say that modern logic implies Aristotle's involvement. At this point, you might ask yourself, if this is true, then what else do we owe to Aristotle? To which I would respond, you fool! That is propositional logic. We must wait for the Stoics to introduce this later. Aristotle didn't use the if-then structure. Instead, he developed what we call predicate logic. This uses descriptions of classes or types to create an argument. Consider this cogent argument. All podcasters have a like and subscribe button. I am a podcaster. I have a like and subscribe button, which you should go ahead and press right now. This kind of reasoning is foundational for geometry, algebra, and beyond, as well as my ratings in the podcast world. Aristotle essentially gave us the intellectual tools to move from assumptions to proven truths, which he called a demonstration, where we demonstrate the proof of a conclusion if, and this is a big if, we can assume the truth of the predicates. The word to describe this pairing of three statements is a syllogism. What's more is Aristotle enumerated all possible combinations of syllogism and concluded which can be true. Consider the sets A, B, and C with the operators all, some, not all, and some not. Then consider how many ways one can combine A with B and B with C to then make a comment about A and its relation to C. For instance, all history teachers are insightful. There exists a Mr. Powell who is a history teacher, therefore all insightful people are called Mr. Powell. Obviously, this is not a valid argument. In total, there are 256 possible combinations of the possible syllogism, although only 24 represent a valid argument. Even then, some of these valid arguments feel insubstantial because they represent a fairly weak statement. Consider, no flowers are animals, all flowers are plants, some plants are not animals. The best way to start to categorize each of the possible types of syllogism would be to use an Euler diagram. Think a Venn diagram, but without the requirement of every set intersection being represented. In the Euler diagram, the sets can be represented as circles, with a circle being overlapped, disjoint, or entirely contained within. 3 circles can be drawn to represent the sets A, B, and C. You then have all possible combinations of the 4 operators on the 3 circles, plus the final statement of the conclusion. Hey look, 256 is 4 to the power of 4. This depiction circles back to my argument that Aristotle invented set theory. Spoiler alert for future episodes, we will be talking a lot about logic, as Aristotle sparked a fire in the imagination of many thinkers. The near developments will be in propositional logic on the Stoics. This is the if-then and the union and intersection. Look out for a future episode on Chrysippus. We will then move into the Arabic tradition and look at inference and analogy. We can then pass the torch to Avicenna, who, by the way, I'm convinced the more I read was a reincarnation of Aristotle. Avicenna, who pretty much started temporal logic, at least we could say it is true that temporal logic did not exist until at least the time of his birth. And here the key phrase, until, is the main temporal logical operator. As I say, spoiler alert, but to be honest, I could happily start a brand new podcast series after Avicenna called The Logisticians, as there is just too much to say and it deserves its own space. But back to the philosopher. In his infinite wisdom, Aristotle distinguished between 2 types of infinity, potential and actual. Potential infinity is a process that can continue indefinitely, like counting numbers. Actual infinity, on the other hand, refers to a completed infinite quantity. Aristotle rejected the existence of actual infinity, arguing it was paradoxical. While this view was eventually challenged by thinkers like Cantor, it's remarkable how Aristotle grappled with concepts that still puzzle mathematicians today. Infinity. It's the gift that keeps on giving forever. Aristotle developed two versions of infinity, which is wild when you consider how many infinities we now consider. We will definitely be returning to the topic when we discuss the difference between countable and uncountable, the size of Aleph null and Beth 1 and other terrifying phrases. In fact, we now consider an infinite number of distinct types of infinity. For now though, Aristotle had the two. Let me put the difference to you in a simple argument. Aristotle believed in a creator god. His primary cause for this was in his analysis of cause itself, mainly that everything must have a cause. However, I prefer his lesser versed argument about infinity. He argued that infinity must be impossible to reach. If every day takes 24 hours to pass, then it would be impossible to reach an infinite number of days into the future. It would take too long. But that does not mean that the world will eventually end. We can always add another day. This is an example of a potential infinity. Happens in the future. We can keep on counting, but never reach the end of the world. In the other direction, however, it cannot be the case that we have already had an infinite number of days, because we've just demonstrated that this would be impossible to achieve. We cannot ever reach infinity. But given that we are here and have achieved something, it stands that there must not have been an infinite number of days. Here we see the rejection of an actual infinity stretching backwards in time, and thus there must have been a first day. Aristotle also addressed the nature of mathematical objects. Were numbers real entities, or were they merely abstractions? He landed somewhere in between. For Aristotle, mathematical objects existed, but only insofar as they were derived from the physical world. This contrasts with Plato's belief in a separate realm of ideal forms. If Plato was team abstract, Aristotle was team concrete, literally. Let me put it to you. Does the number 5 exist? Or do you only ever find it when counting 5 of something? 5 rocks, the rock band 5, 5-star rating for this episode, if you please. Or can a 5 exist in your mind, in some spiritual plane, before you've even given this episode a 5-star rating, without having to be 5 of anything, just 5 in and of itself? Aristotle's influence on mathematics didn't end with his death. Medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas adapted his ideas into Christian theology, preserving his work for future generations. Sadly, not much of his work made it to Europe for about 1,000 years, but it was safely transported to Byzantium and the Arab world before being safely brought back to Europe in Latin translations. For 1,000 years, the European mathematicians only had Plato to keep them company. But during the Renaissance, his logical methods roared onto the scene and inspired mathematicians to seek rigorous proofs, ending the Dark Age and bringing Europe into the modern mathematics that had been flourishing under the Islamic Golden Age. Fast forward to today, and Aristotle's fingerprints are all over the place. His ideas about logic underpin computer algorithms. His notions of causality inform scientific inquiry, and his debates into infinity echo in calculus and set theory. Talk about standing the test of time. Let's bridge the gap between Aristotle's era and ours. One of Aristotle's most enduring contributions is his emphasis on systematic thinking. In a world where data is king, his methods of classification and logic are more relevant than ever. You could say Aristotle was the father of data science because it has been a few episodes since I declared someone the father of something. Although, to be fair to Aristotle, he had a lot of intellectual children. So what can we take away from Aristotle's mathematical legacy? First, his work reminds us that mathematics doesn't stand on its own. It owes its very existence to the language and the logic that is used to describe it. And its motivation is part of a larger web of knowledge deeply connected to philosophy, science, and even art. Second, Aristotle shows us the importance of asking big questions, even when the answers are elusive. And finally, he teaches us that a good stroll can spark great ideas. Thanks for joining me on this walk into Aristotle's life and works, or as Aristotle might put it, a peripatetic journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the Mathematicians podcast for more detailed discussion about the key figures who shaped our world, or you can also follow the pod on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod for my off-topic musings. Next week, we'll explore the motions of Autolycus of Pitane. I shall see you back sphere next week. Until then, goodbye! The music today is Danse Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.